that anyone is ever truly up to talk about Interview with the Vampire, but I'll do it. I'd like to. That show is a total bummer, but it's very well done. I actually started Interview with the Vampire when the first season came out, but I watched it a little too close to getting out of an abusive relationship of my own, and it was just too much, too soon, too little, and now you're coming unglued. Yeah, that's Green Day. But I recently gave it another shot and I'm having way more fun with it. So I guess all this is to say, like, at the end of the day, you know yourself best. Content warning, Interview with the Vampire is a gothic romance, and it is a very well executed, very intense look at abusive relationship dynamics. I think everybody, like, when you talk about abuse and Interview with the Vampire, I think their mind immediately goes to the episode. Like, there's an episode in season 1 that is brutal. It's quite brutal. But really, what I found more upsetting is, like, the abuse that kicks in before then, the more, like, subtle manipulation. But that being said, I do think that Interview with the Vampire is not just a phenomenal TV show, but a masterclass in adapting material to keep content relevant without necessarily making it modern. Especially because, like, the 1994 movie is still within living memory. Like, obviously not even for me, I was born in 1998, but there is still, like, a large part of the population who probably remembers or has seen the 1994 movie, and if you're not familiar with it, while I do think it's, like, it's 100% worth the watch. It's a very fun watch. Tom Cruise is giving probably one of his best performances. Claudia is one of those characters who is so well written that unless you are just not telling her story, I don't think it's really possible to mess her up. Other than that, the 1994 version is very, 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 very silly. It's very difficult to take seriously. And I'm saying that, like, as a film person, like, as somebody who, as a hobby, passion, and interest, goes and watches movies from other areas. Thus, I'm generally unaffected by, like, technological things that make a movie date itself. Interview with the Vampire 1994 is just silly. I don't know what they were thinking throwing Brad Pitt in there. Like, he's giving less than nothing. But in particular, AMC's Interview with the Vampire is a really great example of how to not do something my friend Deja refers to as chocolate dipping. So something that happens and is happening more and more often in modern adaptations or remakes is recasting a character who was originally written to be or perceived to be white and casting a non-white actor. AMC has the wonderfully talented Jacob Anderson playing Louis Pointelac, and instead of just, like, having a Black Louis, completely recontextualizing what Louis' story looks like, means, represents, manifests as when it's coming from the perspective of not just a black man, but a black man from Louisiana. Brilliant. Brilliant. Which, like, as somebody who is from Maryland, which whether that counts as the North or the South honestly depends on which part of the state you're in. Also, as somebody who has family in the South and in the North, so, like, I've spent a lot of time up and down the East Coast of this country, I think it's really important, given the context of Louis and Lestat's relationship being interracial, that Louis de Pointelac is a black man from the. And while I have mixed feelings about making Claudia a black woman, not so much in the way that it's executed in the show. I was a little iffy on it first season, but they really brought me around with the way they handled things in season 2. However, my contention with Claudia is really less of a contention with Claudia and more of a contention with, like, the bigger picture of black people in media. It is just grating that it seems to be one of the only genres where we're willing to accept black women as, like, the main protagonist with no argument is horror, and I would argue that, like, slave movies fall into the horror genre. I don't care if white people disagree. I dropped out of academia so I could stop caring what white people thought about genre. That being said, what really brought me around on this version of Claudia is that I feel she gets opportunities to express her agency and her strength and just her general sense of self in ways that Claudia is usually, like, she's definitely not afforded in the 1994 movie, mostly just because of, like, runtime. Again, I do think that Claudia is one of the best things about the 1994 movie, but honestly, even in the books, like, there is just, a very realistic grit that this Claudia had. A grit that did not compromise her femininity in any way, and that's very rare to see with Black women. A recurrent theme with Claudia is like feeling like and being dressed up like a little doll, and that definitely still translated into this series. But what both of those actresses managed to bring to Claudia in a way that I think is so brilliant is you can sense and feel that this is a kid who is, you know, not had the easiest life, who has had to fight for herself, even when she's dolled up. She looks very pretty. She doesn't look like a fragile doll in the way that Claudia is very much meant to in the 1994 movie. Also, while I understand that the two different actresses playing Claudia was like a result of scheduling and not necessarily a casting or directorial choice, I think it works incredibly well, right? Because the entire first season is like mostly just Louis telling the story, and then Armand is being an absolute weirdo, and like, yeah, his influence is arguably hanging over it in the sense that, like, I don't know that Louis is ever fully capable of not performing to a certain degree when he's around Armand. But once you get into the second season, Armand is helping to tell the story. It's interesting, just like visually, thematically, that as another voice comes into this story, the construction of Claudia, who of course is not able to tell it herself, she changes. That's cool. That's really cool. Like, it's nice to kind of play with the idea that the real Claudia, like Claudia as she would see herself, maybe doesn't really look like either one of those actresses at all. Maybe she's somewhere in between or completely different. Speaking of acting performances, it would be like literally insulting for me not to mention Jacob Anderson and Sam Reed here. They have some of the most insane chemistry I've ever seen on two individuals. And, you know, I'm gonna give it to them, but also I've heard them talk about this in interviews. I'm gonna give it to their intimacy coordinators, okay? Get hip. A good intimacy coordinator can make or break your show. I know because I've been in a production of Spring Awakening that had no intimacy coordinator, and we're all traumatized. This is not a joke. If I had a nickel for every time I've gone out drinking with a member of that cast and that story has come up and we've at one point been like laughing and joking, and then that laughing and joking has slowly faded out into silence until one of us gets the courage to say, you know, I actually really don't think that was okay. Like, I think we probably should have called somebody concerning. Also, while we're talking about intimacy, I think the I don't want to see Armand fuck that old man crowd can politely go kick rocks until their toes break, okay? No, because I'm sick of this. I'm sick of vampire media, where the vampires are all melancholy and brooding and monologuing about the way that time impacts your brain. And so, like, yeah, I know I just happen to constantly be falling in love with 17 to 20-something-year-olds, but when you get to be as ancient as me, you stop seeing age, baby. So I'll love you until you're old and gray, and then the human love interest always gets turned into a vampire before there's an opportunity to deliver on that promise, which seems mighty convenient. I'm excited to see a story where that theme is actually explored. I think that you should be allowed to have, achieve, get intimacy at any age. I think you should be allowed to feel beautiful, sexy, and like you can get topped by a vampire at any age. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Y'all should really strap in though, because we're in a recession, which means vampire media is about to come back and come back hard. Get ready for round 2 of Twilight. Like, I'm not joking. I would love to explain the connection between vampire media and economic recessions to you. However, I do feel it's only ethical that I warn you, monster theory is my special interest. So not only is this about to be incredibly off the cuff, no texts, even though I'm definitely gonna reference some film theory texts, this may go on for a while. One of the most important things to understand about horror as a genre, whether you're talking about Gothic horror, like Interview with the Vampire, or, Lovecraftian horror, is that it's not just about the immediate fear of the monster. A lot of monster theory relies on the understanding that, Noel Carroll's definition of what is a monster in horror film is an extraordinary creature who participates in a cultural taboo. And a lot of monster theory is about understanding that it is the participation in cultural taboo that actually makes monsters horrifying, right? Really what I'm saying is, by the time you're an adult, you have the ability to watch a horror movie and say to yourself, that's not real. I know that's not real, but it still evokes emotion in you. It still creates horror, specifically the feeling of art horror, which Noel Carroll defines as a combination of fear and disgust, right? The way that horror presents in horror film is not necessarily about the kind of fear you feel when you see a jump scare. It's not necessarily about being terrified the whole time or even staying in a state of suspense. Really what it's about is it's about the combination of fear and disgust that leads you to feel like the only thing you can do with what's in front of you is destroy it. So while a lot of people will argue that horror as a genre is either like entirely progressive or entirely productive, I think that's actually impossible to do, because what you consider to be so terrifying and such a cultural taboo that the only thing you can do is destroy it for the safety of society, like what exactly that looks like really depends on whether you politically are progressive or conservative, right? And so what you see in horror as a genre is that, yes, it can be incredibly reductive, misogynistic, racist. There's a very consistent tradition in horror film of aligning marginalized people with the concept of monstrosity. But horror is also a genre where a lot of communist leftists have been able to make their bag, because a lot of times capitalism is the monster. It's very easy to use really any monster as an allegory for capitalism, especially monsters like vampires, where a part of their monstrosity is feeding on other people. When you're looking at especially early European constructions of vampires in film, there's a lot of anti-Semitism driving those depictions, but also when you're looking at Dracula, there are a lot of film scholars who argue that really what the fear of Dracula is, what the fear of vampires is the fear of bourgeoisie preying on the proletariat, right? Specifically, the way that bourgeoisie men prey on proletariat women. That's a recurrent theme in vampire media, even when it's Interview with the Vampire and the two main vampires in question are gay, right? Like, a part of how Louis and Lestat bond is through feeding on and using less privileged women. And a part of what's so horrifying about that concept is that it mirrors what crime looks like in our real world, right? Like, actually the reality of the situation is that your economic status, your class, has a lot to do with whether or not the police care enough to solve your murder. And like, because monster theory and like horror film and film scholarship in general tends to be led by men, I think people oversimplify it when they say that vampires are sex symbols. Vampires are sexy sometimes, but in particular, I think vampires are an example of how we romanticize the concept of men abusing power to take what they want and don't actually interrogate what that looks like and what that means for the women who it's impacting on screen, because of how, like, men having the dominant gaze in film impacts the way we look at violence happening to women on screen. Like, are vampires sexy, or are vampires typically reflective of what we are taught to consider sexy or align with desirable in society? To me, the answer is the second thing. Vampires are famously what? Pale, fit, rich. Vampires are what we are taught to desire. I don't think vampires are actually innately sexy. You can sit there and argue about the eroticism of like feeding on people and the neck bite all you want. I think it's more complex than that. And there is a reason why, particularly within American vampire media, you see such a heavy alignment between vampires and the South. And it's because America tends to assume
that its most blatant examples of the bourgeoisie exist in the South, right? And especially when you're looking at like how young of a country America is in comparison to a lot of other nations, even within Europe, right? It's pretty much impossible for you to be an ancient being existing in this country, especially if you are white, and not have some kind of unsavory alignment with the South or colonization, the Confederacy. See True Blood, Twilight, Vampire Diaries, the television series. And what so much analysis of the wave of vampire media happening during the recession during the aughts missed, because again, analysis of it was predominantly being done by men and white women, is that Twilight, the Vampire Diaries, True Blood, that's not just about like romanticizing the concept of abusive men. It's very much about how like all of those stories center around white women who sit at wildly different financial situations, class statuses, than the vampires they are seeking out. And there's a certain level of romanticizing their situation. All of these stories are about one special white girl who gets to become one of the privileged, who obtains so much power through her transformation into vampirism that she is now untouchable. A lot of early aughts vampire media is about how white women would much rather find a way to assimilate into and benefit from capitalism and the patriarchy than acknowledge that those things are tied together and actually do anything to put an end to any of them. That's how vampires ended up getting romanticized, if you ask me. It's not about the inherent sexiness of the neck bite. It's about how white women have always wanted power. And that class analysis, I think, is integral to understanding Interview with the Vampire as a whole. Right? I think you need to understand how vampires have historically popped up in times of recession to really get the point of that story. Because if you are watching Interview with the Vampire with the understanding or perception that Louis, a landlord's experience as a Black American, was the predominant experience of that time, that's a misread of the text. Louis is not working class. He owns buildings. Louis is not going to work every day. He's managing an estate. Louis is a man who feels he has been barred from having the ultimate privilege. And instead of rejecting it entirely, really what he's looking for is a way to get on an even playing field with those white men. And it's why he's in constant moral conflict, is because he's trying to play a game that you can't morally win. So really, I think what's fun about Interview with the Vampire when you put it in conversation about other vampire media, especially like from the early aughts, is in the early aughts, we have this heavy white woman idealization of power, right? We have this romanticization of the bourgeoisie, of capitalism, of obtaining that insane level of wealth and detachment from the rest of other people that the Cullens have. And then Interview with the Vampire almost seems to be asking, but what kind of a person really wants to access that in the first place? Right? Because I would argue the one true innocent in that series, Claudia, didn't ask to become a vampire, never wanted to be, had no choice in the matter. Vampires pop up when recessions do because they're a reminder that nobody is able to access that level of privilege, power, and wealth without draining another person. And how can you reach a point where you're regularly okay, not just okay with, but delighting in draining other people of things you know they need before you yourself become divorced from your own humanity?
It turns out I'm not done talking about Gene Simmons on Dancing with the Stars, because I agree, he felt very misplaced. And granted, I understand that the whole point was that the theme of the night was hair metal night, and Gene Simmons is a member of KISS. So on the surface, it makes sense to bring him in. But here's the thing, like, as somebody who is very passionate about, like, pop culture through the ages, something Gene Simmons has always been known for is being, like, a massive wild card and a little bit of a creep. I think asking him to come on as a judge for the ballroom dance show was not... Obviously, I don't mean this in terms of the pro dancers or, like, the contestants, but it was production literally begging him to harass somebody. Like, I feel like production knew what they were getting into with that, and it makes me mad. Also, he clearly couldn't be fucked to do the bare minimum amount of research for the job he had taken, which is annoying, but I guess something you get to do when you're fucking Gene Simmons or on that level of iconic, right? Because you've literally got Steven Nodorozic, the pommel horse guy, and he took a moment to do a little pommel horse move in his routine, and Gene Simmons was like, I don't get it. And Alfonso Ribeiro had to be like, he's an Olympic gymnast. Alfonso Ribeiro didn't sound as distressed as I do right now because, and I say this with the utmost genuine respect, but because he's been in the game probably about as long, if not longer, than I've been alive. But I feel like even through the years of media training, you could see how frustrated not just Alfonso Ribeiro, but all of the judges were getting with him. Because it's not uncommon for the guest judges to kind of be like crowd pleasers. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of time the guest judges aren't classically trained ballroom dancers, but their presence at least makes sense, right? Like, Rosie Perez for Soul Train Night not only made sense, but felt necessary. If you can get Rosie Perez, get Rosie Perez. Also, you're talking about somebody who's actually performed, executed, lived, not necessarily ballroom dance, but the flair, the theme of the night that they're intending to add to it. That made sense. Fucking Poppin' Pete on the judging panel would have made more sense than Gene Simmons, even on Hair Metal Night. Like, I feel bad saying this because I really do feel like some of the hate Brooke Snader is getting is genuinely starting to border on misogynistic, but it was so clear that Brooke Snader and Gleb got the first 10 of the night because Gene Simmons thought she was the hottest, and it opened with a pole dance routine. Like, every single time Gene Simmons took a weird amount of time to be like, and one of the most beautiful women in the world is on stage right now, that couple scored super high. And every time he wasn't wildly sexually attracted to one of the people dancing on stage, they scored suspiciously low. And you know what? Here's the thing. I feel like I could fix Dancing with the Stars if you gave me 20 minutes and a weapon to hold to the producer's head, okay? Because you know what I would do? I would literally just make sure that every single week the guest judge was somebody who had been on the show before. You're Dancing with the Stars. You want a guest judge? Call up one of the people whose career you saved. Bitch, you're owned by Disney now. Tell one of your overlords to pull a little puppet string and get somebody who knows what the fuck they're talking about to hold a judge's panel. No, because there were people in the audience that night who could have given better, more clarifying, and consistent commentary and judging than Gene Simmons. Namely, Xochitl Gomez, who won last year. No, because explain to me quickly, other than racism, why was every non-white woman scored suspiciously low? Jen Tran of The Bachelor fame is fucking walking on her knees. I have to stop or I'm like actually screaming. I'm about to get violent. Okay, so again, monster theory is my special interest and zombies are my favorite movie monster. And this is an analysis I hear a lot from white leftists, and I gotta throw a flag on the play because I feel like in order to reach this conclusion, you have to either not know or block out the fact that zombies originated as Haitian folklore, and thus it is very specifically about fear of racialized people rising up. That's when we start to see zombie movies get popular, as evidenced by the fact that the biggest surges in zombie media are the 1930s with White Zombie, 1968 with Night of the Living Dead. George Romero was literally on his way to deliver the final copy of the film when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. And I would say 2012 to like 2020, we see another big wave of zombie media globally following the Black Lives Matter movement. Social death is essentially a term that describes what happens when you are human, but you are not treated as human, when you are not afforded the same rights or the same level as respect as the fellow members of your society, and thus you are not able to influence that society in the same way that any other member of it is. That's what it means to be in a state of social death, and that is a state that, like, The Black diaspora has been put in at large as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization. The true horror of zombies, if you ask me, isn't even necessarily like the cannibalization. It's not so much that they eat the other. Eating the other is me referencing a Bell Hooks essay that actually works very well in tandem with monster theory. As a general rule, when you're looking at a monster that has to consume another group of people in order to survive, you can make an argument for a capitalism allegory or themes of capitalism in the story. But specifically with Haitian zombies, originally it was not resurrected corpses trying to feed on brains or human flesh. Haitian zombies were basically lured into a hypnotic state between living and death, where they were able to be controlled and used for labor. So a lot of stories about Haitian zombies are about like families thinking a loved one was dead and then seeing that loved one tilling someone else's fields with this like nothing behind the eyes look to them. A lot of people credit George Romero's Night of the Living Dead with bringing zombies to the silver screen, and that's not necessarily true for a couple of reasons. One, George Romero was not trying to bring zombies to the silver screen. They're not called that in the movie. That word's not used until Dawn of the Dead, the sequel, because everybody had already started calling them zombies. The first time zombies were put on the screen in Hollywood was White Zombie. And White Zombie, while still an appropriation of Haitian folklore and a terrible representation of voodoo, was still closer to the original inception of Haitian zombies. It was about like a white guy essentially creating zombies as his own workforce to further his own ends, and then he kind of seduces another white guy into using his method for zombieism to seduce, I think it's his girlfriend at the time, into becoming his wife. Weird shit. But it's still first and foremost about the imposition of will, about your body not being your own, about not having the agency, the ability to influence the world around you in the way that everyone else does. And that is something we continue to see with Night of the Living Dead. One of the things that's really crucial about Night of the Living Dead that was not originally planned to be part of its story, because when George Romero wrote the script, he was picturing a white guy, and then he ended up casting a black man. But Night of the Living Dead, a very deliberate part of the acting performances is that, like, Dwan Jones knew he was the only black guy on screen. You are supposed to be reading a certain degree of coding into the fact that, like, Ben, his character, is clearly the most sensible character on screen, and still none of the white people in the room want to listen to him. Night of the Living Dead is essentially a story about a black man who survives a night of zombies and white people's own self-interests just to be killed by the military force sent to save him. The final shot of that movie is the militant force sent to destroy zombies standing over the body of a black man who never became a zombie. Incredibly poignant imagery, especially in 1968. Then we get another wave of zombie media in the 20-teens, right? We get the British show In the Flesh. We get Little Monsters starring Lupita Nyong'o, Train to Busan, a Korean film. What happened in the early 20-teens? There are a lot of events that arguably set this off, but a lot of people argue that it was specifically the death of Trayvon Martin and the protests that followed that propelled the Black Lives Matter movement to becoming globally known. And so all of a sudden what we're seeing is zombieism being used as an allegory for humanity and for who we have tried to take that away from. Who are we relegating to a position of social death? I left out The Walking Dead because I don't like that show. I know it's one of the biggest examples, but I don't like that show. But genuinely, this is why Little Monsters starring Lupita Nyong'o is one of my favorite pieces of zombie media ever made. Is because it is about a black kindergarten teacher trying to get her kindergarten class through the zombie apocalypse. And so allegorically, what we're looking at is the question of who is best equipped to survive an apocalypse driven by social death. The people who confront that state of being every single day, black women and children. Generally, I think it's really important to remember with zombies that yes, a huge focus on the horror is the horror of the masses crushing in. But specifically, it's the horror of the masses who you previously thought were dead. who were relegated to a state in which they were no longer able to influence or harm you. There is a very specific racialized fear to zombies, and not just because of the appropriation. They tend to pop back up in moments where Black people are having these moments on the global stage that raise the global Black consciousness. Disney's zombies pissed me off severely, but not for the reason I think a lot of people assumed it would, right? Like, a lot of people assume that I would hate Disney zombies because it's a ham-fisted attempt at a civil rights allegory in which neither of the main characters are Black. And like, yeah, it was annoying watching that white boy become the Jackie Robinson of zombies. But that's about the quality of anti-racist work I expect in my Disney Channel original movies, right? I feel like they already did their big ones with The Color of Friendship and Johnny Tsunami. Quiet as it's kept, Johnny Tsunami is a movie about how no matter where you go, you should be allowed to preserve your culture however you can. But let me get back on track. But no, what pissed me off about zombies is, oh God, it plays into one of my biggest pet peeves for film, period. Like, anytime a movie does this, it fills me with a level of irritation I can only describe as ass itching. Like, oh, it drives me nuts. I can't stand when a movie isn't about the character it feels like it should be about. Just so y'all get what I'm talking about, I'll use some examples from movies that aren't zombies, right? Like Michaela Baines in Transformers. If you look at the construction of her character, it feels like not only is she set up to be the main character, but it would make infinitely more sense narratively for her to be the center of that story, right? She like actually is a mechanic who works with and understands cars. She has a criminal record, so when you get to the part of the movie where they need to be working at the military, she has like character motivation and a reason to want to work with the military, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense for her as a person. And she is flagrantly named after the director. Or The Exorcist. The priest that movie centers around isn't even the exorcist in question for the first 2/3 of the movie. And anyway, that is 100% Reagan and Chris McNeil's story. We've got this incredibly compelling narrative about a child feeling like she's losing agency over her own body around the same time that puberty kicks in. Heavy symbolism there. There's a single mother struggling to deal with this while also maintaining the charade that she is put together, as all single mothers have to do, because that expectation falls on them in a way that it doesn't on single fathers under the patriarchy. We've got a way more interesting story going on over there. And for some reason, we're spending all of our time on the priest struggling with his faith? The priest who can't do his one job? It's like we have to make a certain number of movies about white men a year, and if we don't, they think society will just turn into goo, and it's ruining cinema. There are no words for how much I stopped caring about zombie Romeo and his platinum blonde cheerleading Juliet the second this diva showed up. It should have been her movie! You've got a white boy trying to serve Jackie Robinson / Jesse Owens of the football field. Meanwhile, you already have a zombie Malcolm X on the roster. She's a light-skinned radical who just has an ambiguously endless knowledge about technology. If the Disney Channel zombie series had been about Eliza, like it should have been, we might have actually had a cure for zombieism by the end of that franchise. Give her 20 minutes and a grant. She could have figured it out. Fuck the Z-Bands. She could have found a for-real cure. The second movie would have just been about building community care with the werewolves. Anyway, Disney zombies needed me in the writer room. That's really what I'm getting at, is that they needed me. I could have fixed that franchise. This is embarrassing, but I was literally waiting for somebody to ask about Claudia specifically because she is one of my favorite characters in media. Period. Whether you're talking about literature, film, television, in every and all inceptions. I think Claudia from Interview with the Vampire is one of the most brilliant case studies on not just how debilitating it can be to be a quote-unquote young woman, but specifically the argument that Bell Hooks makes a lot, which is that children are their own marginalized class and they need to be treated as such. Claudia is doomed by the narrative in more ways than one, right? One of the things that comes up a lot, especially in the AMC version of Interview with a Vampire, because by the time this version has been made, there's already a book and a film adaptation existing, is that you can tell where Claudia's story is going pretty much from the second she's introduced. She's one of the only characters who is not shown at any point in the present. She's one of the only characters who has no ability to tell her own story. Louis has this like weird, like angelic vision of her despite her many objective crimes, and only speaks about her in the past tense. You know pretty much from the second she's introduced, especially if you're paying attention, that Claudia is doomed. But also, like, Claudia was written as a way for Anne Rice to cope with the death of her own daughter. And so, yeah, Claudia is doomed, not just because of all of these things that happen in the narrative, but because that's kind of the point of the story. But in particular, when you are reading vampires as like an allegory for the bourgeoisie or capitalism or those with power under capitalism, Claudia is doomed for the same reason we're all doomed. Claudia is born under capitalism, a system that dictates her two options moving forward are to either be consumed by that system or become one of the monsters perpetuating it and sacrifice her own humanity. There is absolutely a psychology to film and very much a psychology to children's media and children in film. And one of the things that I think is super important to remember, whether you're analyzing children's media or just watching a child like Claudia, a child character in adult media, is that children psychologically, like within their brains and the way that it functions, do not have the ability to distinguish between real and not real the way that adults do. They do not have the ability to conceptualize consequences in the way that adults do. Tangent, that's a part of why I think it's so unethical that you only need to be 18 to join the military. This has been a huge topic of conversation with Love is Blind season 7 coming out because military service is a big conflict for one of the couples. But something I witnessed genuinely growing up in like a sundown town where there's a lot of poor, not just white, but black people who would not have been able to afford college, much less the lives they lead now without joining military service and gaining those benefits, is there's a lot of kids and teenagers who genuinely cannot conceptualize how much harm they're causing until they're much older. And Claudia is very much representative of that group. She becomes a vampire at an age where psychologically she is not capable of dissecting the moral, philosophical, biological, ethical implications of what she's doing. And especially in the AMC version, what I think is so fascinating about the way they adapt Louis is that Claudia's initial demise, like what kills her as a human, is the same thing that resurrects her. It's Louis' quest to find a compromise between power and morality, right? Like, Claudia is ultimately the victim of a race riot that is started by Louis acting in a way that literally no other black person from his time period was permitted to act, right? Again, Louis was a landlord. The average black person in New Orleans during the 1930s was not a landlord. He is working with a higher level of power and privilege than the average black person from his time, and that's a theme that I think is really well reinforced. And I rarely say this, but by casting a light skin. I actually think that considering his upward mobility in society, this is one of the rare circumstances in which casting like a light skin actor, again, not that Jacob Anderson isn't wildly talented, but colorism exists, actually makes the most sense. It's also why, even if ultimately the decision or the necessity of recasting Claudia in season 2 was because of scheduling still worked so well, it makes sense that in the first season, when Louis is the one telling the story, he imagines a Claudia who looks a lot more like him. That's incredibly compelling. If
you're familiar with the original inception of and like movie adaptations of Interview with the Vampire and like the continuing Anne Rice novels, you know that like within the books, you will see Black women who are vampires. Within the movies, you will see Black women who are vampires, but specifically making Claudia a Black child, a Black girl, somebody who on every access of her identity is not allowed to express her power is incredibly significant. Claudia delights in the violence she creates as a vampire because the only other option is to hate herself for a choice she didn't make. Right? Claudia delights in the violence of her lifestyle because that's the only option for her. And something that I find incredibly resonant about that as a Black feminine presenting person is like, yeah, in pretty much every room, conversation, particularly argument I walk into, I'm perceived as being the monster. I'm the bad guy. I'm the nag. I'm here to ruin everybody's fun and bring up the thing that nobody wants to talk about, which is usually just the perspective of a Black woman. And so something I really leaned into, especially in college, and there's definitely something to be said about the fact that I'm light-skinned and the ability that I had, the fact that I had the ability to play into this role and still be safe. Something I really leaned into was like, okay, if you fucking hate me before I open my mouth, I'm gonna make damn sure you remember what I said. There were a lot of times in college where I absolutely delighted in being the obstinate Black girl, and I have no shame about that. But when you're looking at not just like the literal implications of eating in the context of Claudia being a vampire, but within the context of like eating the other as Bell Hooks described it, eating the other as like society's need to consume and destroy anything and everything that falls outside of its very narrow understanding. Everything and everybody Claudia delights in eating is somebody who within society probably would have eaten her first. Like, does that make sense? Nobody asked, but here's a short list of people I think would have contributed more as a guest judge than Gene Simmons. John Bon Jovi, Derek Huff, like a second Derek Huff, like a clone, dressed up as Gene Simmons. Or you know what? Mark Ballas was already there. Dress him up like Gene Simmons. I don't know that anybody would have cared. I think you could have lied to the public about having Gene Simmons and it would have gone over better than his actual presence on the show. I think they could have moved Reginald VelJohnson from contestant to judge and he would have contributed more than Gene Simmons. I think they could have brought in a house plant and made up scores that it would give out, and that would have contributed more than Gene Simmons and definitely would have sexually harassed less women. I think they could have gotten Will Smith and had him just run bits with Alfonso Ribeiro, and that would...
I actually have deep personal beef with The Last of Us, and this is the part of the show where I will potentially break some hearts and get myself in trouble, but it would be very silly of me to try and talk about The Last of Us, especially right now, without addressing the fact that the creator, Neil Druckmann, is in fact Israeli, was inspired to tell this story because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and while on its surface, if you're doing a surface level analysis, it's very easy to think that The Last of Us is both sidesing it, right? That it's about finding the humanity in both sides of that conflict. I disagree. I think The Last of Us is blatant Israeli power fantasy, and Neil Druckmann has talked a lot about how the point of the game is to try to invite the players to feel universal hate in the same way that people feel universal love, right? The goal is to get players to feel as volatile as Joel did, right? When he killed another person to save his daughter. It's about questioning how far would you go to make people suffer in the way that you feel you've been made to suffer. And I find that ideology to be deeply,
deeply Zionist. Like, it's not just the cycle of violence, it's justifying Zionism. And I have particular beef with an Israeli man using zombies, a monster that has its origins in Haitian folklore and the Black diasporic experience with the slave trade, and using it to perpetuate his own colonial agenda. I also find that sentiment infuriating because I feel like it, and again, this is probably silly that I'm getting this worked up about a movie monster, but it's really not just about the movie monster. It's about the devastating and continuous loss of human life, and the fact that, like, something as simple as my favorite movie monster isn't safe from being used as a tool to further the oppression of other people. That's really what I'm getting irritated about, is that, like, even the things Black people create to cope with our oppression can be appropriated and used to harm other people, and I'm real fed up with that. But a part of the point of zombies is to see their humanity. And that's something that The Last of Us 2 does, and it pisses me off that it's like an afterthought. Like, okay, we've created this game where we invite you to see these zombies as, like, terrible, universally hated creatures who you should want to kill on sight, and now we're gonna unpack that in the sequel. Don't piss me off. And it just particularly incenses me because this story is not just, like, appropriating a monster that I love, that is tied to, like, a diaspora that I come from and that I adore. Like, I feel like people don't take me seriously when I say that. I love being Black. I love being a part of the Black diaspora. I love this community, flaws and all. I would not trade this skin for anything and everything in the world. And trust me, a lot of people have tried to make me feel otherwise. But where I start to get incensed is there are deliberate and consistent attempts on behalf of Israel to try and convince Black Americans that they are actually more aligned with our interests than Palestinians are, and that is markedly not true. You can find, like, actual footage of Israeli officials talking about how one of the things they wanted to do when the Black Lives Matter movement started to really pick up global traction was find ways to convince leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement that they should be supporting Israel, because they recognize that Black Lives Matter was just that powerful, was just that influential. And most horrifyingly, horrifyingly to Israel, what Black Lives Matter did is it placed Black Americans' conflict in the larger tapestry of the globe. And when you are looking at the conflict of Black Americans in the larger tapestry of the globe, it's impossible not to notice the similarities between Black Americans and Palestinians. Like, yes, obviously Indigenous Americans and Palestinians, but also, like, we have skin in the game. Every bombed village is my hometown, every dehumanized people group is my kin, and keep colonizers the fuck away from zombies. That's the manifesto.
I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I did watch all 3 Zombies movies in their entirety last night, and it turns out I have things to say. Because, oh god, it's a gift and a curse. But when you love film as much as I do, even bad movies have a kernel of potential to you. And Zombies, the franchise, had potential. Wasted potential. Obviously not financially. That series has proven to be quite lucrative to Disney, but I mean as, like, a movie that will inevitably, as all movies do, date itself as time passes. I do think Zombies actually had the potential to be a Disney Channel original movie that could have aged with grace and said something very interesting, and it's all undercut by the fact that I don't even think the writers fully understood or appreciated the allegories they were writing. I think probably one of the funniest things about Zombies is that it just decides to ignore the most basic rule of sequels, which is, like, if you're gonna do a sequel, the point should probably be to tie up the loose ends from your last movie, not Zombies. The Zombies franchise very boldly said, instead of resolving any of the problems left open in the first film, let's just keep adding new ones. Because there are some genuinely troubling implications raised about not just, like, the nature of being a zombie, but the Z-bands in the first movie, right? Like, I think it's really easy to fall into the movie's message and be like, oh, they're zombies, they've got their own culture and lifestyle, their, like, way of life needs to be respected. Except that, like, people being born a zombie is the result of an allegorical nuclear disaster. Like, those people have allegorical radiation poisoning. When Zed messes with his Z-band, it causes him, like, actual physical harm, the Z-Bands are used against them in the first movie. Like, the cheerleaders hack into them and use them to force the zombies to zombie out and try to hurt people. Like, these are people still actively suffering from something. And it's painted as, like, we're supposed to ignore the fact that these people clearly need a cure because they've managed to create their own, like, culture and lifestyle in the face of it. And I have a lot of feelings about that, especially as, like, a Black queer person, right? Because when I said, like, if Eliza had been the main character in the first series, or in the zombie series, we probably would have had a cure for zombieism. And a lot of people were like, well, isn't that problematic? Because, you know, like, the zombies are like their own culture. One, don't tell me how to feel about an allegory of my own history, culture, and race. That's the fastest way to piss me off. Two, despite the way they try to play it in the movies, being a zombie is unlike being literally any other monster they introduce in that series, because the state of being a zombie is not, like, intrinsically a part of this people group's culture, right? Like, the aliens have a history stretching back centuries. The werewolves predate the town of Seabrook. Really, what I don't like, especially when you're looking at zombies as being a blatant allegory for Black Americans, is the implication that our culture didn't exist until, like, 50 years ago when Jim Crow ended. The history of Black Americans and our culture is something that has been developing since the Middle Passage. Scholars will tell you that. Like, the opening line of the 1619 Project is they say we're a people who were born on the sea. If anything, we need to see, like, more Black people in mermaid allegories. Also, I hated Zed. I have never seen a main protagonist less on task. Oh my god, everybody else is worried about getting their rights, and Zed is chasing a snow bunny and worried about the football team. I felt this way about Addison and Zed, and it was really conflicting because usually I feel the other way around about characters. Like, usually I look at characters and I'm like, you're a terrible person. Like, I would never want to spend time with you, but I love your construction as a character. I hated Addison and Zed as characters. I thought they were poorly constructed vehicles for the story they were telling. I found them to be delightful people. Zed is incredibly charming, and I genuinely think it has a lot to do with the actor because the script is not giving him much. But Milo Manheim is just less afraid to be goofy than the average Disney heartthrob, and in a love story as silly as Zombies, that works. His goofy, cartoonish reactions to things, the faces he makes, those are charming. They work for Zed. They make him very endearing. And there's also something endearing to, like, I mean, yeah, this kid's a zombie. He's grown up in a place called Zombie Town. I'm sure he doesn't feel like his entire world is changing every time they find out a new monster exists because, like, well, yeah, that's his life. But then when you look at the roles that is serving allegorically, he is like the member of an oppressed class who is being afforded the most opportunities and privileges, and he never quite seems to fully appreciate that. Because he's only doing all of this for Addison and for his own personal interest, which is fine. He's a teenager. But if you think that there aren't Black teenagers who kind of, like, wake up one day, get hip to their struggle, and realize that the cause matters more than their own lives, you would be mistaken. And the movie clearly knows that because that character exists in Eliza. Or, like, Addison, right? In terms of story construction and allegory, she's a white savior, which is annoying. As a person, that's just a high empathy autistic who doesn't really understand why all of these people she's seeing aren't considered people, and she gets made fun of for, like, really silly reasons. Like, I would have barked at her bullies. And yes, I know, the whole point of the third movie is that Addison was not actually human the whole time, and therefore not actually allegorically white the whole time. She was actually an alien, and that was why she never fit in. However, I have two contentions with that. One, they keep saying Addison doesn't belong. Meanwhile, she's running the school. Imagine, in your high school, if one girl went on, like, a work study or, like, a foreign exchange student program. Would your entire town shut down? Would the fact that she's not here be announced first thing at graduation? No, people love Addison. She absolutely belongs. She just wants to feel special. And that's part of what's so frustrating about her story, is it does not feel like a white girl looking for belonging because she's the fucking cheer captain. It feels like a white girl wanting to feel more special than the monster she's befriended. And my second contention with that is that Addison is arguably still allegorically white in that she is allegorically white passing, right? Addison's only alien trait is something she can cover with a wig. If the only thing about me, phenotypically, that presented as black was a little bit of a curl pattern, I would be white passing. And if a character who looked like me was put in the position of being an allegorical white savior, or at least me in the timeline where I'm white passing is what I mean, I would still say that that's a white savior. Like, she's still an alien. Go with God in your lavender and claim your heritage. I don't care. Dye that hair blue, girlfriend, but it doesn't make it less irritating. Especially because all of the more compelling characters on screen in that franchise are black women, and they get sidelined. Chandler Kinney, you were sidelined. See, but here's the problem with me, though, is that if they had given that romance between Chandler Kinney's werewolf and that alien girl about 45 minutes of screen time, I could have and would have forgiven all that movie's sins. Or you know what? If Zombies had decided it wanted to be a satire, because if you watch Zombies and pretend it's a satire of the way white people do civil rights allegories, it's actually quite good, and Zed becomes a very compelling, interesting illustration of a self-hating black man. But again, you have to do a lot of work to make Zombies good. So I think I'm just gonna give it 15 years and then reboot that. We'll try again when I'm in creative control, because I don't want to sound like I've got a god complex, but I think this series needs me specifically.
We put a man on the moon over 50 years ago. 50 years ago. Why did we stop? We could have had them all up there by now.
Y'all see that video of Tom Holland? That video of him pulling Zendaya out of the paparazzi crowd, they was crowding around her. She was signing. It was so rom-com coded, not even rom-com, but just, I swear to God, I've read that scene in a fucking book. Zendaya, the people's princess, signing autographs, looking amazing. And the paparazzi just swarm her. She's still smiling, still looking good for fans, paparazzi. Tom Holland, a knight in shining armor, says, "Get the fuck out the way." Moves the people out the way, grabs his woman by the hand, and pulls her to safety. Oh! That's a man. 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 That's a good man, Zendaya. That's a good man. That's a good man. And I know it seems so simple, but I can't think of any other celebrity couple where I've seen the man rescue his girl from paparazzi crowding around them. The way he did it was so classy, very subtle. He didn't make a scene, but he said, "Get the fuck away from my woman." Oh! Tom Holland, the man you are.
Women who are extremely male-centered will never truly be your friend. I've literally had girls, when I'm trying to make plans with them, they will wait until the last possible second to confirm because they're waiting to see if a guy they just met will text them back. And this guy is not their soulmate or something. They will do this for literally any guy because their self-worth revolves around what guys think of them. They will be jealous of you and they'll treat everything like a competition for the male gaze. I've known women who are absolutely beautiful. They should have no reason to feel like I'm their competition, but they will still find ways to put you down and embarrass you because they crave male attention that badly. But the number one reason I can't be friends with girls that are extremely male-centered is because you just can't have a good night out with them without involving men in some way. And that can definitely be fun, but some days you just want to have a girls' night. But girls that are male-centered will be like, "Oh, let's go over to that guy's table. Let's go back to this guy's place." And it's no, we don't need to involve random men to have fun. Also, it's extremely dangerous to be going off of random guys you don't know. If you try to get me to leave a public place to go over to some random man's apartment, I'm sorry, I'm out. We literally don't know who these guys are. are. Why are we putting ourselves in a dangerous situation just for some attention? Like, are we really that desperate? I've joked about this before, like your conversations with your friends need to be able to pass the Bechdel test, but it's literally true. If every conversation you're having is revolving around some guy or like how to get male attention, then that girl is too male-centered and she's never going to be a good friend to you. Also, speaking from experience, if this girl does get a boyfriend, it's going to be the end of your friendship. And I know people are going to say, obviously I'm going to hang out with my boyfriend more than my friends, like I love him. And I'm not saying you can't hang out with your boyfriend all the time. Obviously, if you like them a lot, you should hang out with them. But there's a difference between hanging out with your boyfriend and completely ditching your friends because you got a boyfriend. I've found that girls that do this, they'll still keep you in arm's reach so that they can still talk to you when they're having drama with their boyfriend. So they'll basically use you as a therapist when they need it, but when things are going good, it's radio silence. I had to cut a girl off as a friend because I felt so used by her. When we were friends, it didn't matter if we made plans like 2.5 weeks in advance. If her boyfriend texted her like 10 minutes before we were supposed to hang out, she would just cancel the plans immediately. But if her and her boyfriend were having problems, I was the first person that she would call. But that girl clearly did not view me as a friend. She viewed me as a therapist for her. And yes, you can totally be there for your friends, but when your friend's whole life revolves around a man and you're just there to give her validation when things aren't going well, then there's no actual friendship there. Okay, that's all for today. Bye, guys.
I wish that the world was a safer place for Black women, and I wish I could walk into any room and not be immediately assumed to be like this mean, horrible, terrible person who's plotting against everyone else, and I wish that I was understood immediately, and I wish that I could see myself in every single piece of media that I consume, but that's not the way that life is, and I wish that every single day, and I'm so tired. I'm so tired of being misunderstood as a Black woman, for my passion and for my enthusiasm and for my feelings to be misconstrued and perceived as anger or just relegated as anger, because that's the only kind of acceptable kind of emotion that you have in your mind for me to be able to express. I'm angry. Are you happy? I'm angry. But I'm also sad, and I'm hurt, and I'm pained, and I feel unseen and unappreciated frequently in the environments that we inhabit, and it needs to stop. I know this one video isn't gonna change all of your minds, but let it make you think!
Toodles!